give Ms. Leung, Christina a warm welcome and a big applause. Christina.
Thank you, Francis, and thank you, Bailey. So for me, I'm just going to run through a lot of the key developments that's going on in the New Zealand economy, focusing also on the property sector and what's going on. So in terms of what we're seeing in the New Zealand economy, a lot of the headwinds that we're facing are very similar to what's going on in the other major economies. So primarily with high inflation and now more recently with rising interest rates. We're seeing the impact of this high inflation and also now more recently with increased interest rates. Most immediate impact being on the softening in the housing market here in New Zealand. And then of course, when it comes to our relationship with Asia, China remains a key trading partner for New Zealand.
这是我们可以纵观整个现在的房地产市场的状况哈。目前新西兰房地产市场遇到的所有的问题都在其他的经济体都是会遇到的，比如说现在很高的通胀率，这种通胀率呢，它是这个可以影响到各个层面哈，包括建筑啊，还有其他的贸易啊等等。说起到这个新西兰它的因为经济体比较小嘛，受到影响的各方面也是比较多的比如说亚洲这方面，跟中国是一个最大的贸易合作伙伴。
So this chart here shows GDP, so quarterly, what happened to all the labels? Anyway, this is the profile of quarterly GDP and it shows, we can see that firstly that sharp decline from the first lockdown and then more recently the impact of the more recent lockdown, which as we know is shallower because it was briefer. What we can see with the release of the June quarter GDP release this morning was that activity increased by 1.7% for the June quarter. Now this is a lot stronger than what a lot of the anecdotes out there in terms of softening activity had talked about, but what it reflects is that firstly there was a rebound in services activity and that reflects the New Zealand economy as the restrictions were being lifted with the New Zealand economy moving from red traffic light to orange, so a lot of that activity was more able to take place. Also with the relaxation of the international borders, we saw a lot more tourism activity and the increased transport from more flights operating in the air. So a lot of that rebound in services activity driving the strong, pretty robust GDP result for the June quarter. What it does show is that the New Zealand economy is in fairly resilient shape.
本年度本年度的一个增长表哈，其实这些就是这些都是每一个季度的情况。我们可以看到在这个第三季度lockdown 的时候，第二季度的时候。这个 this is the inflation，
这是 GDP， so quarterly GDP，
就是季度的这个 GDP 的一个在 lockdown 的时候有一个非常陡的这么一个下降。这个下降以后呢，但是这个之后就慢慢的往前这个又往起升了。所以呢，这个整个的这个目前就是昨天吧，有一个这个最新的一个经济公布。这个整体的来讲，新西兰的这个 GDP 是有增长的。这个增长的绝大部分的它的贡献的这个地方呢，是整个服务业类的一个增长，包括一些比如说开放了这个边界之后，有一些好多的这个一次的国际航线的这种飞行量的一个增加。所以呢，它这个 GDP 其实就
You expect a slowing in activity. Now we've had a strong June quarter result, but as the impact of high interest rates start to dampen demand, we do expect growth to slow over the coming years.
6月份这个季度呢，这个我们看它的后边呢，有可能还是会接着有一个经济的一个下行。但是呢，整体再往后讲的话，再往长远看的话，还会有许多的经济的各种活动的增长，这时候可能还有一个变化。
Can I ask? Sorry,
Yeah, sure.
The time frame for that, is that quarterly, monthly or yearly?
Yeah, so that's quarterly GDP, and then that dotted line and beyond our forecast.
Right.
So we can see that yes, we have that blip back up, but as the impact of interest rates start to impact dampen demand, that growth, that recovery will start to slow.
这个图表呢，横的这个轴呢，它是这个季度的啊，都是按季度来分的。这个季度来呢，就是看在这个在6月份的时候，它lockdown 的时候它是有一个下降，但是后面的经济这还有一个因素就是高的这个银行利率，它都会有影响，然后慢慢的在这之后还有一些其他的一些活动的表现。
So what all this means is that in economics we always say everything comes back to supply and demand. So we've had very strong rebound in activity, but what the COVID pandemic also created was a lot of supply constraints in the New Zealand economy. So it's such that we had demand far outpacing the supply given the constraints in the economy, and that has led to a surge in inflation. So if we look at annual CPI inflation, that's running at 7.3%, reflecting a broad-based increase in prices across a broad range of goods and services.
经济学其实就是一个供给还有一个需求的这么一个整个的一个关系的一个学问。在最开始的时候，我们有经历了这个叫疫情吧，这个疫情呢严重影响了供需的关系。比如说，疫情在它的供给方面和疫情方面，就是它的这个供给和疫情相比非常非常的落后。所以这种落后呢，它就是也可以从这个很高昂的这个通货膨胀率可以看到7.9左右的通货膨胀率。这个通货膨胀率就是反映出了这个在这种经济受到影响的这个供给和需求关系影响下，它展现出来的一个表现。
Now, this 7.3% is well above the Reserve Bank's 1 to 3% inflation target band, and so for the Reserve Bank, a key concern is. Firstly, yes, high inflation is a concern, but what's the main risk for them is that this high inflation will become entrenched in the New Zealand economy. So if we look at longer term inflation expectations, for example, the 2-year ahead inflation expectations, that has eased a little bit in the most recent quarter, but it still remains above the Reserve Bank's 1 to 3% target band, which means that the Reserve Bank will be keen to bring inflation pressures down to ensure that high inflation doesn't become entrenched in the New Zealand economy.
就是现在的这个7.9%的通货膨胀率，对于这个新西兰的储备银行来讲，他们是非常非常超过他们的预期的。所以这个高通胀率对经济的这种影响会是非常的巨大的。但是储备银行也感觉到，如果继续让这个通胀率保持在这个水平的话，它会对这个有很多的这个负面吧。所以他们也一定会把这个通胀率矫正一下，然后就是为了赶上这个经济的发展。
So this high inflation is not just something that's facing the New Zealand economy alone. We're also seeing it in the other major economies. For example, in the US, annual inflation running above 8%, and in Europe running above 9%. And what that's meant is that central banks around the world are now increasing interest rates quite rapidly in order to rein in inflation pressures around the world. And we can see that in this chart here, where the Reserve Bank of New Zealand is very much leading the way in increasing the OCR quicker and at a fast pace. But then beyond that, other central banks are catching up. And we can see that with the 50 to 75 basis point rate increases in some of the other major economies.
这种通胀率的这个不是这个银行的利率，还有这个通胀率是相关联的哈。世界各大行其实都是不光是新西兰世界各大行，比如说欧洲的银行还有美国的银行，他们都是这个为了把这个通胀率降下的话，他们都增长了这个利率。这个利率呢，其实增长的新西兰银行还是跑到前头的，还是比这些其他的银行他们做的还要更快一些。所以呢，就是其他的银行其实也跟着新西兰的步伐吧，都是把这个利率增加，主要就是为了释放这个通胀率的压力。 高通胀率的压力。
Started to impact on confidence. This chart here shows consumer confidence, and with that combination of that rising in household living costs, and now with it that increase in interest rates, households are starting to feel a bit more downbeat about everything. This chart here shows firstly how they're feeling in general, confidence levels, but also how positive they're feeling when it comes to making big ticket purchase items. And we can see that households are starting to feel less positive when it comes to spending on things such as electronics, furniture, just given that more environment of heightened uncertainty.
实际上通货膨胀呢，其实是把大家的消费信心，它都会有很大的影响。所以这张图表呢是介绍了一下表现了消费信心的一个起伏状态。这个消费信心包括他买这些大额的各种生活需要之外，还包括住房这些这个数字就表明了在通胀情况下，在这么多年的通胀情况下，这个消费信心指数的起落。
When it comes to Great. Hopefully that stays. Although both charts really show what's going on in the housing market. So the first one was the map of how house sales have tracked over the past year across the different regions. And what we can see is that as a whole for New Zealand, we have seen that immediate impact of high interest rates on the housing market, with house sales overall nationwide declining 18% from a year ago levels. Now what we're seeing is that with rising interest rates, demand for housing has softened, but a lot of potential sellers have yet to adjust their price expectations to this weaker market, and so there has been a bit of holding pattern going on. What this means is that house sales have declined, but when it comes to house prices, they haven't declined to the same degree, just because there has yet to be that adjustment in price, making the market at a lower level taking place.
这个是呢，整个新西兰从2008年到2022年，新西兰全境房地产的走势图，可以看到从2021年的最高点到现在这种情况，到现在已经它降低了18%，但是呢，在把银行利率提高了以后，它的对于房地产的增幅太过的这种压力得到了一些缓解。这样的话呢，实际上你可以看到，到目前为止，它应该还没有完全调整到位，还应该，因为它其实是上一个正常价值的一个回归。他没讲，但是我想他说的就是在房地产到了去年那个高度以后，最高的高点的时候往下降了一些，实际上他是做了一个正常调整的这么一个步伐吧。但是后边Christina, did you say this adjustment is not stopped yet?
That's right. There's still further adjustment.
That's right. Yes. 所以这种调整它应该还没有完全到位，后边应该还会有一些进一步的调整。
And it's also important to note that across the regions, Auckland is leading the way in terms of the weakness. Now that's, you do tend to see the Auckland housing market lead the other regions. And what we're seeing is that when it comes to house prices, over the past year, Auckland house prices have declined by 9%, relative to New Zealand, excluding Auckland, which has declined by 3%. So we do expect that this weakness will start to broaden beyond Auckland to the other regions over the coming year, just given to the extent to which Auckland tends to lead the other regions.
从奥克兰来讲呢，因为它在整个新西兰的房地产市场是非常的是处在领导地位的，所以呢，它的从奥克兰房地市场来看，它其实是降了9%，但是它Auckland market has dropped 9%.
In terms of house prices.
Auckland house prices. 奥克兰的房地产市场的房价降了9%。这样的话呢，它实际上这个调整，它从全国范围上来讲，奥克兰它实际上就等于它 过热以后，它的这个调整，应该整个全境只有3%啊，奥克兰调整9%，它还是把这个上一波的这种过热做了一下就是灭了一下火吧，做一下调整，以便和整个全国的房地产市场它的这个降幅做一个接近。
And also what's interesting to note is that even with the New Zealand house prices having dropped 6% over the past year, if we compare it back to levels where it was March 2020, which can be considered the pre-COVID levels, we can see that house prices, despite the more recent declines, are still actually around 25% higher than March 2020 levels. So that just goes to show just how much house prices have surged over the past 2 years.
实际上我们刚才讲了这么多哈，在最近2年这个房地产它整个的这个降了，最近1年降了降了15%、18%，但是哈，如果我们往回头看，我们看到我们是2020年3月份，这就是这以前的这个数据哈，这个我们可以把它看作是这个疫情之前的数据，把这2个做成比较的话，我们从最低点到最高点还是有20%多的涨幅，所以我们整个房地产市场现在经历的虽然是大幅度下跌，但是你要拉开了看，从最早的那个疫情前来看的话，还是在一个很大的一个增长期。
Our quarterly survey of business opinion that we release every quarter, which every quarter we survey around 1,000 businesses on a wide range of things such as what they're seeing in regards to demand in their own business, how they're feeling about the economy in general, what they're experiencing in terms of cost pressures, hiring, investment plans, and what this chart shows, although there are no labels for some reason here, is that the black line shows how businesses are feeling when it comes to general economic conditions, and we can see that over 60% of businesses are expecting a deterioration in economic conditions over the coming months. However, when we look at that blue line there, which is asking businesses what they're actually experiencing when it comes to demand in their own business, we can see that yes, demand has generally been weaker, but we can see it more as a stabilizing at a lower level rather than a catastrophic decline as such.
其实这是一个整个新西兰全国的business 就是所有的生意他们状况的这么一个总结表哈，它这个代表什么它已经没有了，但是这个黑色呢，黑色就是表示在这个疫情期间整个这个生意的它的这个起伏的这个状态，实际上生意都是有整个全国来讲，它的生意的这个信心或者是生意的业绩下降的是非常厉害的。但是呢，我们要再看这个蓝色这个就是现在我们这个出来的这个数据哈，这个它其实我们尤其是现在它跟这个黑的值比起来的话，整个的商业信心还有商业的这个目前的成长还是不是像大家想象的那种灾难式的，还是比较温和的。So sorry, make it clear. The blue line shows that the confidence of the business has not that worse, comparing to the pandemic.
So the blue line shows what businesses demand in their own business.
Yes.
And then the black line is how they feel.
Yeah. Sorry. 对，就抱歉啊，我这翻错了。其实这个蓝线呢，它表述的是这个生意它的这个需求，生意的需求，这个蓝线表示出来这个生意的需求，就是比如说这个生意，你要做这个生意是不是能做起来，或者是多少人需要你做的时候，有多少人需要你这个生意，对这个生意的这个需求，实际上它的这个需求并不是降得那么厉害。下面这个是它的这个 black line is
The black line is how they feel about the economy in general.
这个蓝色的是代表的是大家对这个目前的现在的这个经济状况、生意状况，他们的感觉，就是感觉是低的，但是其实实际上你要做生意，真正做生意的结果或做生意的时候，你是感受到是不是做的还不错，这种实际情况和这个的差别还是有一定的更好的吧，比起来应该比这个要更好。实际情况跟你们的感觉相比，实际情况要更好一些。
And then when it comes to so this chart, again with no labels, it shows construction cost inflation. So capacity pressure, we have, there's been a lot of capacity pressures in the New Zealand economy. One of the areas where it's been most apparent is in the construction sector. So this chart here shows the different areas of construction. So residential construction, that blue line there, the red line there being civil construction, so we can think of that as infrastructure, and then the black line there showing non-residential construction. Overall, we're seeing that surge in construction cost inflation, reflecting the fact that there's a lot of very acute capacity pressures in the construction sector in New Zealand.
这张图表呢是展现的是整个这个建筑成本的它的这个通胀情况哈。这个蓝色的呢是实际上是民宅建筑成本通货膨胀的状况，黑色的呢是基础建设的建筑成本的这个状况，这个红色的呢是商业非民用这个建筑成本它的这个增长的它的这个通货膨胀的这个状况。So the inflation chart shows the
annual growth in construction costs. So yeah, so that's residential, civil construction, and non-residential construction there.
And that is the does it show the demands as well?
So it shows the change in prices for building.
The price only, not
yeah,
demand.
So only price. Yeah.
这个图表仅仅是展现了它的这个它这个高是它的这个价格哈，它跟那个供求没有关系哈，都是价格，包括民宅，包括商业，还有包括基础设施、建筑成本的增加。
So a lot of that, those capacity constraints in the construction sector stem from supply shortage of materials, given global supply chain disruptions, and then also labour shortages, given the inability for firms to be bringing workers from overseas.
这个主要还是就是大家都了解的，一个是这个在这个疫情情况下，整个这个建筑成本还有这个流通都不好。整个的这个价格都不好，再一个呢，它还有一个就是没有人没有这个可以进来外来的这些工人啦，或者是其他的这些技术工人能够来干这些，所以造成在这边现有的这个劳动人口就是这个可以雇人工的成本增加。
So this this map here shows how dwelling consent issuance has tracked from a year ago, and what we can see is that there's been strong growth in demand for residential construction, as reflected in dwelling consent issuance across the regions. This indicates that there's a strong pipeline of residential construction for the coming year. Now, more recently though, there are builders and developers have reported a softening in new inquiries for building. So it does suggest that there will be a weakening in residential construction activity, but not till next year.
这个图呢，就是显示出来这个整个Christina, the light green and green.
Yeah, so darker green would show stronger growth.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay. So 这个两种绿色哈，这个。深色的绿色就是这个是表示强劲增长的这个颜色。实际上，这个强劲增长颜色是在整个的这个新西兰是有非常大的一个表现。就是可以看到哈，就是目前来讲预测建筑申请的这些数量，台色一直在增加，将来的1-2年还会有非常大的像井喷一样的建筑对于。民宅建筑啊，这都是民宅建筑 consent 的，将来会，现在地的也很多，将来会出来的这个民宅建筑量也会很大。
Asia, particularly China, is a key export market for New Zealand. The fact that 40% of our exports to China is dairy, and then also meat and forestry are key exports to China as well. Looking ahead, we do see some risks from, for example, the global growth outlook and the disruptions from China with their continuing lockdowns as they continue to pursue their zero COVID policy. But overall, that underlying demand there should still be pretty resilient.
这个呢是
Solid. Yeah.
这个是这个新西兰对外整个贸易量的一个图表，这整个主要是亚洲哈，新西兰跟中国之间的贸易占40%，这个40%包括农产品、林产品还有奶制品。整体来讲，虽然说现在中国目前的这个新零政策呀，造成一些中国供给链的这个供货链的一个不完整，再加上跟中美之间的这些贸易上的这些摩擦，但是总体上来讲，中国和新西兰之间的贸易是非常的贸易基础是非常坚实的。
Now, on the import side, we can see also how important China is, Asia and particularly China is when it comes to being a source of imports for us. The fact it's our key source of imports. Looking ahead, we do see some slowing given the household slowing in retail spending as households here in New Zealand face high mortgage rates and adjust their spending and hence that reduction in imports going forward.
这个呢是进口，主要是进口的新西兰从国外进口这个数量的这么一个表，中国毫無疑問也是新西兰最大的进口国。可以看到从中国进口的这个数量有所减少，这个是因为新西兰现在大家的 mortgage 房屋贷款太多，所以可以花钱的比较可以动用的自由支配的这个资金比较少，所以呢他们的购买力有所下降。所以从中国的一些进口也少了一些。
Also worth noting, the pandemic revealed just how interconnected the global supply chain is. For example, seeing the disruptions in manufacturing activity in China reverberate those, the impact flowing through to the other major economies and just disrupting production around the world.
还是可以看到整个这个疫情对世界整体经济的一些破坏哈。一个就是中国现在清零政策，造成很多供给链不能够完善的运转，所以呢，但是这个实际上这些因为全球都是一体化的嘛，所以这些任何的一个，尤其是中国这个制造端出现问题，都会对整个的这个世界经济，包括新西兰的经济有很大的一个影响。
Now, what does this all mean for interest rates? The million-dollar question. So this chart here shows the official cash rate, which is the Reserve Bank of New Zealand's policy rate, and we can see that already the Reserve Bank has increased the OCR quite rapidly with 50 basis point rate increases over the past year. Going forward, we do expect, firstly, with inflation pressures so intense, that there will be further interest rate increases to come. The key question is just how much they will have to increase interest rates to bring inflation back to their inflation target band of 1 to 3%. As I was showed earlier, with inflation at 7.3%, there is still a fair bit of work to do. So certainly interest rates will keep going up, and we believe that they will increase the OCR 4 more times at a more measured pace of 25 basis points for the OCR to reach 4% next year and remain there for an extended period of time.
这个其实是一个100万的一个问题啊，这个是新西兰储备银行它整个的这个利率的一个增长这么一个图表。现在来讲呢，新西兰的储备银行一直是在加息，加息的这个力度也非常大。它这个加息的力度，它加息就是为了把这个通胀率给降低。很有可能呢，它还会再接着加息，因为现在的通胀率7.3%嘛，最终他们要将通胀率控制在1.3%到2%之间，所以呢，加息还是会进一步进行，而且一定会继续I think this is about 4%.
So we believe 4%, but we do want to recognise there are upside risks to this 4%, so potential for it to rise above 4%.
OK. 最终的目标有可能是储备银行的利率啊，有可能是基准利率加到4%，甚至于比4%更高啊。目前从现在开始依然会往下，后边依然会再加息。
Interest rates in the short term, what that's done is that around the world in the major economies, there's been increasing concerns about what all this means for the longer term growth outlook, with fears that it will trigger recession. Overall, what that has meant is that with central banks raising interest rates at the short end, but concerns about the longer term inflation outlook, that's led to put downward pressure on longer term interest rates and led to an inversion of the yield curve. In normal times, we would expect to see the yield curve to be upward sloping to reflect the fact that investors are receiving more compensation for having the increased risk of their investments being held for longer, but not the case currently, where we are facing an inverted yield curve.
Again, please. 大概的意思啊，当然我再跟他确认一下，就是现在整体来讲，储备银行这种加息的步伐很有可能会造成经济衰退。这种经济衰退呢，实际上就是也对这个投资人的这个信心会有这个打压。实际上这种经济衰退它会造成一个what sort of yield curve?
Like interest rates.
Interest rate yield curve.
Yeah. So this is, apologies for not, I don't know where the labels have gone, but it should be like 2 years. So at that end it's 2 years, and then at the most right it's 10 years. So generally you would expect that the longer term interest rates would be higher than short term interest rates, and for it to be upward sloping. But because at the moment there's so much concern about the longer term growth outlook, that's putting downward pressure on 10-year interest rates, and hence we have this environment where we have an inverted yield curve, downward sloping.
就是说，因为这种情况呢，实际上就是储备银行的这种焦虑吧，它会把这个对于将来远期的利率和long-term interest rate will be higher than
in normal times,
yes.
But at the moment it's lower than short-term interest rates.
That's because the
concerns about growth in the long term.
But is it because of the international environment?
That's right. So in the long term, that's a very good question. So for the New Zealand yield curve, which this shows, in the short term it reflects what the central bank here is doing. But when it comes to longer term interest rates, that has global developments has a bigger influence on what happens to New Zealand long-term interest rates.
正常来讲呢，应该是银行应该是对于远期的利率应该更高，近期的利率更低。但是现在不是这种情况，因为有很多的不确定性，包括这个整个国际上的这种复杂形势，还有这个疫情，还有等等的这种大国之间的博弈吧。所以整个储备银行，世界各国都一样，他们是更把远期的利率就是他们的担忧更是在远期，所以远期的利率要比近期的利率要高，所以它是倒过来的。
See the mortgage yield curve become inverted, it would have implications for how effective future monetary policy moves will be. We tend to see households go for the lowest rates, mortgage rate at that point in time. And if we were to see longer term fixed mortgage rates be quite a fair bit lower than the short term, you will start to see a lot more fixing at the longer end, which means that when it comes time for the Reserve Bank to move monetary policy, the flow-through impact onto households in the broader economy will be that much more delayed.
Okay, the fixed mortgage interest rate.
Yeah. So
yeah, it's
pretty flat, to be honest, at the moment. Yeah.
Why is that? Because the Reserve Bank is more concerned of the long term.
Yeah, so the mortgage curve does reflect to a large degree what's going on in wholesale interest rates, which is what this shows, wholesale interest rates. And then, so you can think of it as longer term interest rates are reflects expectations of growth outlook, and also particularly what's going on globally, whereas the short term, particularly the floating interest mortgage rate, reflects the OCR, so it reflects more what the Reserve Bank here in New Zealand is doing.
Okay. 还有就是它这个咱们说有浮动利率，还有这个咱们说这个叫远期的固定利率。这种固定利率呢，实际上是这实际上是储备银行对远期的预估，浮动利率就是储备银行他们现在想要做的事情。浮动利率它一般来讲，它就是看它就是现在它就是想要把这个他们现在so the Reserve Bank is the floating 要到 OCR 呀，
Yeah.
所以它是要控制 OCR， 就是它的这个OCR 就贷款的比例吧，它是要控制就是比较高。然后远期利率呢，是对于储备银行对于远期的这个经济预期，他们还是要稍微的比现在他们做的这个浮动利率来讲，他们要更稍微的放松一些。
Book and the amount of repricing of the New Zealand mortgage book ahead. And what we can see with the black and red area is that around 44% of mortgages in New Zealand will be due for repricing over the coming 12 months. So for a lot of these mortgages, we would be looking at households that have been enjoying fixed mortgage rates of around 2 to 3%, now moving to something closer to 5%.
这个其实是一个新西兰现在整个国家它的这个个人房屋贷款的一个情况哈。你看这个黑色这个呢，就是告诉咱们，他这个黑色的人，他们现在的付的这个利率是2%左右，但是呢，从明年开始，这部分人，他们这个2%的这个固定利率就要到期了，他们就要重新再把这个以现在的这个利率重新要再固定他们的这个贷款利率。
So what this means is that it will likely lead to a lot of adjustment for households when, in terms of facing higher mortgage repayments and having to adjust their spending. We don't believe that it will lead to a hard landing for the New Zealand economy, just given how solid the labour market is and the pickup in wage growth that we've been experiencing. So with that increase in household incomes, it will provide that buffer for the households to be able to move on to absorb these higher mortgage repayments.
这个虽然说大家看到这一部分，实际上还是就是付少利率的这些人，马上就要面临要付高利率了。但是呢，他们就是新西兰的经济学家预估，这种状况并不会造成新西兰经济的硬着陆，还会因为什么呢？就是这个问题是有解的哈，不会对经济造成影响，就是因为一直以来工党一直在加薪，一直在给大家加薪，所以大家的这个整体的这个收入是增加了。再一个呢，就是整个这个经济上，还有是经济的活动也是比较活跃的了。反正将来要开了关之后，应该也是有更多的这个生意机会了。所以这一部分马上要释放出来，从负的少的这个利率到高利率的这一部分的风险是不会造成整个经济的这个负担或者是崩溃的。这是储备银行的预测哈，所以应该没问题。
Overall, what this all means is that New Zealand and the other major economies are facing many of the very similar challenges in the form of high inflation and now with it rapidly rising interest rates. We have seen the more immediate impact of this high interest rates on the housing market here in New Zealand, but we do expect over the coming year to see a slowing more broadly in economic activity as households adjust to high mortgage repayments and that adjustment in spending that's required. However, with the labour market still being fairly tight, we do expect that will provide buffer in terms of the landing for the economy, given that households will still be able to service their mortgages. In terms of overall global demand, we expect that will still remain fairly solid, even though there are ongoing risks, particularly as with the continued lockdowns in China and the disruptions to activity from that, and also, of course, the energy crisis over in Europe.
他们这个目前来讲呢，新西兰的这些目前遇到的这个问题，实际上是一个整个的国际性的问题，所有的经济体也都在遇到，就是高利率、高通胀率。但是呢，新西兰这边呢，他们预测应该没有什么太大的问题，就是因为首先一个是就是说这个工资增加，再一个就是现在新西兰还是非常缺劳动力的，是非常缺就是工作机会还是很多的，所以这个应该是整个新西兰就是从这个目前的这个大家需要再用更多的这个钱要付更高的这个贷款利率的这个主要问题上来讲，这个应该是不会有太大的问题。同时，从整个国际的供给和需求来讲， 它虽然说是现在有一些问题吧，但是整体来讲是稳定的，而且是坚持的，没什么问题哈。
And that's pretty much what I had. But how to take questions?
好，let me translate our questions first. 刚才这个会员的女儿尤兰达刚才问一个问题，就是说对于高的这个通胀率和这个利率，怎么能够让它降下来？怎么把这个问题解决？
So with inflation so high, what central banks are doing is by increasing interest rates, that will help to slow demand to a more sustainable level, particularly given just how constrained supply is. So it's about bringing demand closer to lower levels of where supply is at, and that's how they would bring down inflation. And that's by increasing interest rates. Now, of course, the key question is just how high they'll need to increase interest rates in order to bring inflation back towards their target bands, respectively. I'm not sure if you've heard, like in the financial markets, we have this, there's always that catchphrase now, if there's strong data now being released, people say good news is bad news, because for equity markets, while it's strong, what it means is that central banks will have to do more in terms of interest rate increases in order to bring inflation down. So for equity markets, that's negative. High interest rates generally are negative for equity markets.
其实这个把这个利率降低的它的这个主要的目的就是为了降低通货膨胀。通货膨胀呢，实际上就是要调整这个供给和需求的之间的这个关系。但是最主要的问题实际上就是降到多低，这个利率降到多低才能够把这个中间的这个差补上，才能够才能把这个通胀率降到这个合理的这个水平。实际上呢，这就是好多大家讲的，又是好消息，对某些人、某些行业是好消息。坏消息也是对某些人、对某些行业是坏消息。你比如说是对这个 equity 什么意思来着 ？equity 是什么意思来着？是固定资产是吗？对，不动产。equity 是不动产的意思啊。不动产行业对于不动产的行业来讲，这个是一个比如说这种房地产这是一个好消息啊。但是呢，要是对于其他的，比如说就是什么零售这些其他的方面，这就是一个坏消息。所以 so you can't say at what point it's going to be break even. I mean
the interest rates. So it's the question about neutral interest rates, where long-term equilibrium interest rate has to be. That's a question it's a very good question, and it's one that central banks around the world are still working on, because the reality is because neutral interest rates are unobservable, to be honest, it's something that you can only realise in hindsight. The fact that you've got a level of interest rates, you see inflation still running very high, and hence the level of neutral must be higher than where current is. So it's not really something that, and we've seen that over the past decade where the interest rate has gone down, and now it's going back up. So every time people say this time it's different, but really it's more people's perceptions have changed.
就是说刚才我们讲到，就是到底在哪个点，就是把这个到平衡了，该降到这个大家能够有作为的这么一个状态。但是呢，实际上这个事儿呢，是大家所有的银行、所有的这些经济学人士都想要知道的这么一个答案。实际上，它这个的工作原理就是，有的时候它也是不按照这个预想吧，来发展的。就是实际上就是利率升高，通胀下降。应该就是这么一个工作一个规律，但是有的时候它也是有些情况下它不是按照这个形式来走，所以呢也不好说到底是在，反正现在这个中间点在哪儿，大家还没有找到。
If the demand for a lot of the larger developers we're hearing is falling off, and they're going to presumably build less going forward. How will that affect the price of new homes next year?
Peter 的问题哈，就是说现在比如说我们新西兰有很多一些大的开发商，如果说这个大的开发商他们没法盖了哈。Oh, sorry, what was the question again?
So we presume that a lot of the larger developers have fallen off and orders.
Yeah.
So, with less houses being built next
That's
year,
right. Yeah.
what are you expecting the house price to be?
就是现在，如果比如说我们很多人，不管是大的开发商，他们没有办法如期交房，如期盖这些把这个房子推上市，这样的话，会对于将来的房地产的市场价格有什么影响？
So to the extent that we've seen that surge in house prices and now seeing a partial correction of that, what we've seen is that as house building activity has ramped up, total dwelling consents for the year to date, over the past year has totaled over 50,000. So we can see that we've talked a lot about this housing shortage, but with this large increase in residential building activity, that housing shortage has been chipped away over the past few years. Now that there's less of that incentive for developers to bring new housing onto the market, you would less likely see that housing shortage flip over to excess housing supply, and that will provide, with housing supply still below where housing demand is at, it will help to limit the extent of further house price declines. We do expect further house price declines over the coming year, but to the extent that because that new supply is not coming on board at the rapid pace that we've been getting, it will limit that extent to how much it'll fall.
Could that impact inflation? I mean, could that alter where the perception of inflation is? I mean, might make it drag it on further.
It's interesting because if you look over the past, say 10 years, we've had general CPI inflation quite low, remaining quite low, and central banks trying to have very loose monetary policy to stimulate that inflation back up to the target band. And what that's done is pile into housing and to some extent equities as well. So to some extent, yes, they are meant to be related, but it's pulled away over the past year. And what we're seeing now is that reversing with high general inflation, but with that rise in interest rates impacting on house prices.
So there's going to be an increase. 是因为呢，其实这个房屋的价格还是有一个供求的一个关系哈。当时这会儿我们一直是说，房屋现在有缺口，有多少的，每年都有多少缺口。但是在这一段时间以来呢，其实这个供求和这个需求，供给和需求，它做了一个调整。其实这个缺口已经都在弥补了。所以呢，现在来讲，尤其是经过了这个就是咱们说 COVID 以后，经过了比如说建筑的材料短期上涨啊等等，通货膨胀啊等等，现在再说这个房地产的这种增长或者说是这个缺口的这个对于这个后边价格的影响，它还是会有，但是他讲就是因为我也不明白他反正是说的一些经济上的原因吧，它这个价格的这个走低不会太厉害，不会是特别大的一个降低，是吧？会是吧？他说了半天的那个经济上的什么原因，但是就是说这个缺口补上，然后将来这个储备银行它也要做一些这个方面的工作吧，调整，然后会有降低，但是不会特别的可怕这种降低啊。
Do you think it's realistic for our Reserve Bank to still stick to the conventional band of 1 to 3%, and therefore hike the OSR probably too much or too frequently?
So in terms of whether its mandate should still be 1 to 3%, absolutely, in order to maintain credibility, so that you can anchor longer term inflation expectations. We know that low stable inflation is the best environment for growth to be able to continue. So to that extent, the mandate. When it comes to, what was the second part of your question? There was that...
OCR being hiked too.
Yes, that's right. So the risk of the OCR going the other way, to the extent, although hindsight is a wonderful thing, to the extent Reserve Bank has had eased too much over the past few years, there is the risk that it now overshoots the other way and hikes too much. What that would mean, again, as I was saying, you only realise that to some extent in hindsight. And what we can see is that if demand was to fall quite a lot sharper than what they expected, you would expect them to then start cutting interest rates in response.
OK， 后一年的这个问题呢，就是说看澳大利亚还有英国的他们这些储备银行的这个利率状况问这个 Christina， 新西兰的储备银行会不会也是继续的把这个加息加很高的一个程度？Christina 回答呢是说，现在实际上这个银行的这个目标就是把通胀降下来，然后靠通过这个加息的这个方式，有可能哈，他说是还是最主要的就是要是这个 OCR 就是这个贷款比例啊，他要把它还是要控制住，也就是说，银行还是会把这个利息要像其他的国家一样要增加的。
Like, so we have a joke about picking bottoms. All you get is a smelly finger.
刚才那个小谢问的问题，就是大家最关心的就是想问一下，什么时候他预测房地产市场能够再起来这是大家都关心的。
But in terms of, we do expect further house price declines, but when we will start to see that light at the end of the tunnel, we do expect that as we were saying, there's going to be a correction, but with the reduction in residential house building activity, that will limit the extent to which prices, you get excess housing supply, which we wouldn't want because that would be where you start to get house prices decline quite sharply. We don't see that happening. So that will be sometime in terms of when we'll see a recovery, potentially later next year.
是这样，他说其实我们其实已经在黑色的这个通道里面，马上就要见到一缕阳光了哈。其实它这个过去这段时间吧，将近1年的时间，这个房价在下降哈，它实际上这个已经释放了一些这个就是一再跌嘛，已经把这个泡沫已经挤出去一部分了。实际上呢，他觉得应该在明年后半年就可以起来了。这个最关键的哈。
But also, as economists, we also say, joke it really depends because there's a lot of different factors. When the Reserve Bank will stop increasing interest rates, a lot of the other factors, what happens with the global growth outlook as well, what happens with net migration, that to some extent reflects immigration policy. Of course, when we get strong net migration inflows, that population growth will drive housing demand. So if we were to at the moment, we're still continuing to see net outflows out of the country, which reduces the pressure in terms of housing demand, reduces housing demand. So we always say it depends.
还有一个他也讲过，就是因为现在的这种房地产状况嘛，所以大家盖房的就是供给已经很少了，盖房的可以买房子，可以在市场上做的提供的房产已经很少了，已经少了，所以这也是就是释放了这些泡沫的一个组成部分吧。再有一个就是经济学家呢，一般都不说这个死的话，都说活话，还有说呢，它还要是有很多其他的因素，就包括因为现在我们还是在这个净流出的人口还是比净流入的这个人口要多嘛，但是一旦这个反转过来了。来的移民多了，然后世界形势又有变化了包括什么政党交替呀，还有包括其他的一些所有我们能够想得到还有想不到这个因素如果都叠加上去的话，那整个这个房地产它的这个预测就又会受到影响。That gentleman's question of when the price will rise again, you said it's about later next year, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. I remember.
Like we still have interest rates at historically low levels, but because in this period of low interest rate environment, what we've seen is debt levels, household debt levels continuing to rise. This means that from a debt serviceability point of view, it's going to be that much more sensitive to any interest rate increase. That means that, I mean, never say never, but we're unlikely to see interest rates go back up to the previous highs that we've had back in history, just because we've got debt at much higher levels.
Okay, because we are in the high level of debt, so we cannot, the mortgage interest rate cannot go rise about that high as before.
Because it would be very hard to service that amount of debt.
I see.
It's more bang for buck.
OK，刚才 Christina 她的问题就是说，其实从新西兰的整个咱们要如果回顾历史的话，最高的时候，新西兰的贷款利率最高达到22%，在几十年以前。现在呢，我们一直说涨，但是整个来讲，我们还是在一个低利率的一个水平。Christina 的问题就是在这种情况下，那个银行利率就是会增长到什么程度来影响这些借贷的人就不借了？他是这个问题哈。Christina 讲了，他说这个呢，他就回顾了一下，就是我们虽然是现在说高，可是实际上对比以前我们是不高的，这个我们的现在的这个利率，而且呢。再高也涨是涨，但是不可能太高。它这里是有原因的啊，这个原因就是大家借贷的比例太多了，债太多了。这个债如果太多还不了，大家都死了，所以就不能再涨。这个是阻碍，就因为大家的负债率太高，因为这个原因，这个银行的利率它就不能再涨得那么高，否则大家全死了，经济就崩溃了，就是这意思。就是账多了就不愁了。是这意思是吧？
Developers to borrow any money from their banks. So what's your advice or message to those developers?
I think from a bank's point of view and whether to lend, it's the ability to service. So it comes back to how do you make the cash flows work.
That's very simple answer. 刚才霍律师的这个问题就是，那现在等于这种状态下嘛，我们很多的开发商他们从什么途径都融不了资了，银行也不贷，别的金融机构也不贷。这种情况呢，想问一下 Christina， 她的这个忠告是什么给大家，或者是她能给大家传达一个什么样的信息？Christina 的这个忠告就是，大家最好按照自己兜里有多少钱。来计划怎么花啊？你自己能调动多少资金就干多大事儿，是吧？
On individual circumstances, whether you value flexibility over certainty. So there's no one right answer because it really depends on your individual circumstances. Now, I would say a lot of your investment choices will reflect. Be influenced by the degree, the investment horizon that you're looking at. For example, if it's long-term investment, and I would say that from over 10 to over 20 years, say, then generally those growth assets that they would still work and you should still work in your favour. That said, you must be prepared to ride out the highs and lows in the short term. If it's funds that you're looking to use, for example, over the next 3 to 5 years, then you're probably safer to go with more defensive investments, even if it's at the most safe level, cash.
OK， 刚才您的这个问题好像是问，就是说在这种高通胀情况下的资产的这配置或者是投资的配比，是吧？Christina 讲的是，实际上这个还是根据个人的情况吧，是一个非常个人的问题。但是它总体的原则就是，你比如说有一些就是长期投资的，可以选择像什么不动产啊什么等等。但是要是说短期的，就是最能应急的还是存现金啊。Property market will still have further declining from now on, but it won't be that sharp, and it will be better later next year.
That's right. Yeah.
就是这个意思哈。有从现在开始有还是会有进一步的跌，但是跌的幅度不是非常大，但明年晚些时候这个就会有一个反转了。啊，这是对这个今天的总结。